Greetings everybody and welcome to one of our Flowgear bite-sized videos, the purpose of which is to get you, the integrator, up to speed with some of the very important features and concepts within the Flowgear platform. And on top of that, we'll be looking at one of our very common use cases. The very first thing we're going to want to do is to log into our Flowgear tenant. Now we will have provided you with a Flowgear tenant ID. You can see I've plugged mine in on the top here, and then you'll obviously provide the user against which you would like to authenticate. Once that's been done, you can go ahead and click on Next, and that's going to log you into the Flowgear console. Now, based on the user you provided, your role will determine what you can and can't do. So through role-based access, effectively, you'll be able to navigate to certain portions of the Flowgear console. Now, ultimately, each of these Flowgear tenants is deployed against its own VM, which is going to provide you with a maximum level of separation and security. Now, the primary purpose of the console is to provide you, the user, with a space in which you can seamlessly transition to the different elements of the platform that you may find yourself working with. How this is functionally done is through selecting any of the navigational elements of on the navigation bar on the left-hand side. Let's start at the bottom, and we can go through a handful of these. Starting with drop points. Drop points are a lightweight agent that you can install on-prem, which is going to facilitate a persistent outbound connection to the primary Flowgear environment. What this functionally means is, irrespective of where your primary Flowgear environment is hosted, you're going to be able to install this tool directly on another on-prem system and still be able to get data to and from your Flowgear environment and the system in which you've installed the tool against. Connections are a place to plug in credentials unique to a particular platform or product. So if we open up one of our connections, just as an example, Salesforce, you'll notice that we can plug in credentials that would serve to authenticate you with Salesforce. And we'll be specific around what we require within the naming of the particular properties. And you can also take a look at our help article, which is going to give you an idea of what each one does and how you could potentially acquire it. Now, you can effectively go and test against that as well using the test connection button. There we go. You will then note that you have in fact been able to connect to that environment. You'll also see that you can go and click on different environments here. Test UAT in production. Functionally, this allows you to plug in different sets of credentials for the different environments you may own or have access to. Now, you can customize this. You can have additional environments. You can change their names. You can remove some. Ultimately, we're not always aware of what your environment looks like in terms of lifecycle management, so you get to set it up according to what your current policy or procedure has been up until this point. It also plays a large role in how we do lifecycle management in general within Flowgear, and we'll get to that a bit later as well. Now let's take a look at workflow logs. This is a place in which we are able to store the transactional inputs and outputs of all the nodes that have executed within the platform. And you can see what those inputs and outputs are here. You can also redact that as well. So anything you do not want to be stored can be redacted and therefore will never be stored on the Flowgear platform. And functionally what this place does is it allows developers or anybody developing or maintaining these solutions to have a very good view of what has happened on the platform so that they could potentially debug and solve a problem should one arise. It's not going to fill the purpose of reporting to your end users or integration reporting in general. Those kinds of tasks whereby, as an example, you want to report a number of invoices processed, which of them failed and why they failed, that would be something that is built alongside the workflows themselves. Finally, we can take a look at workflows. Workflows are the design canvases on which we actually build these solutions. So here's where we then facilitate that drag and drop and low to no code design. And we're going to go ahead and open one up and give you a bit more detail around what that looks like. Let's go ahead and open up a brand new workflow. You can go ahead and do this by clicking on the new workflow button over here. We'll then have a randomly generated name, which of course you're welcome to change. And we can go ahead and confirm that on the bottom right. We're then greeted with a Flowgear design canvas, the primary purpose of which is to expose all of Flowgear's pre-built tooling so that you, the integrator, can drag and drop that onto the canvas and then build some kind of integration or automation, really to whatever level of complexity you require. Now, as I've said, there's a big emphasis on drag and drop, and there's an emphasis on low to no code based on your preference and the kind of tools you'd like to use. Now, how we can expose these tools to the canvas is by clicking on any of the plus icons you see popping up as I hover around. And we're then going to be greeted with these tools as a list of nodes. We call them nodes. They're best described as elements that can be dropped onto the design canvas that will then provide a particular integration process. So in other words, they're going to be doing something for you. Now, depending on what they're doing for you, we'll have them categorized into one of 4 distinct categories. The very first category is our connectors. They will effectively connect to the systems that we want to integrate and automate, and they do this by exposing as much of that vendor's API functionality as is possible, and exposing those actions at something called samples. That might not make a lot of sense right now, but you'll see exactly what that looks like a little bit later. We then have triggers. Triggers will determine the condition upon which a workflow executes. So in other words, it allows you to determine whether your workflow should execute once daily, based off of an email arriving in an inbox, a particular queue. There are a number of mechanisms to determine whether your workflow should kick off. Processes are going to work with data in memory with the intent to transform that data and prepare it for the next stage, whether that's one of many or the final stage of ingress. Effectively, what these nodes will do is ensure that you can enrich, supplement, transform, and validate the data to get it into the systems that you're actually attempting to integrate with. And finally, flow control gives you the ability to enable conditional branching on the canvas, and that conditional branching will form the high-level logic for things like error handling, business logic, any kind of decision making that the workflow has to actually make, even if that data has to be handled by a separate workflow or anything of that sort. Now, ultimately, it's a collection of all of these nodes that allow you to build these integrations to whatever level of complexity you require. Triggers are then going to facilitate the condition upon which the workflow executes. So it will determine whether your workflow should kick off twice daily, once an email arrives in a particular inbox, monitor a particular queue. There's a number of options for why a workflow would or wouldn't kick off. We then have processes, the primary purpose of which is to go ahead and work with the extracted data in memory with the intent to transform that data and prep it for the next step, whether that is one of many steps or the final step of ingress. Functionally, they will go ahead and transform, enrich, validate, and supplement those data sets so that you can move them across to the systems you want them to be in. Finally, we have flow control. Flow control nodes will allow you to enable conditional branching on the canvas, which forms a big portion of your high-level logic or decision making. This could be error handling. This could be determining whether a particular process has to be kicked off by a sub-workflow, whether an invoice has to be processed with a different kind of mapping. It is once again going to allow you to make a lot of the decisions that make up your production-ready workflow. It is, of course, a collection of all of these different categories that allow you to build these integrations and automations to whatever level of complexity you require. Enterprise API gives you the ability to turn any workflow into an API-bound endpoint. This means that through the typical design experience within Flowgear, you can go ahead and expose some of that functionality or data to a web endpoint, which can then be consumed by a third-party application or program that has the ability to do so. So here, in a very brief example, we're extracting information from SQL, we're mapping that into a JSON payload, and we're functionally exposing that to an endpoint that somebody can consume. And we can see how this is done by heading over to Settings, Workflow Settings, and we'll notice that we've applied a get binding to this workflow. We have our demo domain, of course, which should be customizable according to your tenant, and then we have the actual URL for test contacts. And should somebody have this URL and the appropriate access token, they can go ahead and extract a list of contacts from the database that we've hooked up within Flowgear. Revision management is a feature which allows you to inspect the design of a previous version of a workflow. You can do so by clicking on the revision history button over here. And then you can take a look at the different versions that had been saved in the past and open up any one of them. That provides you with the design of that workflow at the time that it was saved. You can then even revert to that version as the latest version by saving over the workflow, and you'll be expected to ensure that you are happy to do so by confirming with a yes for confirmation. Revision management is one of the many tools Flowgear exposes as part of our lifecycle management suite. Release management is another powerful feature within Flowgear's suite of lifecycle management tools. Release management works by preventing workflow design changes from immediately affecting production. This is done by enforcing the process of a user with the appropriate permissions promoting workflow design across the relevant environments until it is ready to be promoted into production. Let's take a look at how this is actually performed. So here we have a workflow which we're going to go ahead and save. We can provide a save or commit message over here. And then we'll receive confirmation of the workflow being saved through the green banner. At which point we can go ahead and open up the release management by clicking on this button over here. We will notice that this particular workflow has a version in test, but none in UAT or production yet. And so what we can do at this point is we can actually promote the workflow across to UAT. This will then allow us to execute the workflow in the UAT environment using the credentials that were provided in the connection under the UAT tab. And then once we're happy with that, we can go ahead and do the final portion by promoting this into production. Similarly to what I've just done. Now you're welcome to use the UI that Flowgear exposes to do this, but realistically what's happening in the back end is these particular designs are going to be stored as GitHub commits. And so you can actually see a text-based version of the workflow, which you can then compare against older versions. So while you're welcome to use it in the manner that I've just shown you, ideally you're able to forklift whatever your lifecycle management policy and procedure is into something like a GitHub environment and effectively run your pipelines and your commits and approvals as you've been doing up until now. So for this demonstration, we'll be looking at customer import, which will obviously involve customer information in the shape of a CSV file, which will then be consumed and interpreted and then pushed along to Salesforce using the Salesforce API. What we're going to focus on within this demonstration is the use of our flat file node, which will interpret that CSV file, and of course the use of our Salesforce connector, which is going to then talk to the Salesforce API for us. Now what we'll also spend a bit of time on is some of the elements that would turn this into a production-ready integration. Let's kick off first by discussing a bit about what this integration is actually supposed to do for us. So let's go ahead and open up the source file and take a look at what that data looks like. Here we have our customers.txt. It's simply a CSV file that's been opened up in Notepad, and you can see some of the information that's been presented here, such as name, surname, address, and lines. And of course, we're going to then go ahead and consume this and push this across to Salesforce. Heading over to our Salesforce accounts, we'll notice that we only have a single account in our test environment. And so when we execute this integration, we expect it to be populated with the data we saw inside of that file. So swapping back over to that particular screen, we can go ahead and execute this integration from start to finish. We'll notice the activity log is actually going to pop up showing us what we're seeing. Now, a very important part of this particular integration is the fact that we're using a file watcher to determine that a file has actually arrived within that particular folder. So let's go ahead and plug that folder with the new file, and we can go ahead and see if this integration picks it up. So we'll go ahead and move our customers into our processing folder, which is being monitored by our integration, and immediately we'll see how the activity log picks up the next steps, which involved finding that file and ultimately processing it. At which point we can head back to our recently viewed accounts, give it a refresh, and there we can see the rest of the data now being represented within our list. Now, what's very neat about how some of the tools have allowed us to build this integration is we can actually go back to the particular file we used previously, modify a particular portion of it. Say, for instance, we can edit somebody's address to 124 Main Street, save this, and should we plug that file again into our processing folder, we'll have it picked up by the integration once more. But what we'll notice this time is the actual data going into Salesforce is only going to be the single row that was modified by myself previously. And we do this through a couple of tools, which we're going to speak on shortly. So let's go ahead and open up a brand new canvas, and we can teach you how to build out some of the basic elements of what you've seen here, as well as talk to some of the things that make the production-ready version of this possible. Now that we have a blank canvas in front of us, let's go ahead and begin building out some of what you saw in the previous integration. Now we can begin this process by getting the appropriate nodes onto the canvas. So what you saw previously was us pulling a particular file from our system when it had arrived in a particular inbox. What we're going to do is simply expose the data to our clipboard and post it into the relevant nodes so that we can go ahead and work with it as such. So what we'll do is we will provide ourselves with a flat file node on the canvas. We can go ahead and then plug a quick map onto the canvas. And then we can finally go and throw our Salesforce node. Now at this point, what we want to do is take a look at the different elements of this particular workflow, whereby we have something that has to provide us with data, a mapping phase, and then what's going to consume that data. Now on the left-hand side, in order to get an idea of what that data is going to look like as we work with it on the canvas, we have to execute the flat file node with that flat file content. So we can simply take what's on the clipboard and paste it into the appropriate property. That would of course be your flat file document. So we can go and paste this here. And we'll notice that this is a proper CSV in that there are commas delimiting each record or row, sorry. So what we're going to do is change the column delimiter instead of from a tab, but to a column delimiter, excuse me. Now at that point, we can go ahead and we can actually execute this node in isolation by saying run this node, or well, we have to save it first and then run this node. The activity log will show us what happened, and we can take a look at the output and determine whether we have our XML document represented accurately on the side. Now this is perfect. The only problem here is that we do not have column headers, and there were column headers in that source document, so we're going to expose those by clicking on the Has Column Names checkbox. From there on, we can try and execute this again. Options, run this node, and we should see one for one what we were seeing previously, and that's perfect. We can go ahead and we can actually close off our logs and provide that XML document as the source for QuickMap. Now on the Salesforce side, what we would like to do first is get a connection to Salesforce. So obviously we've pre-set these up. Now I'm going to pick one on my list. However, if you want to see what this looks like, you can go ahead and edit that connection on your side. And if you haven't created one yet, you'll be given the opportunity to do so in a space like this, whereby you can provide the particular credentials. Now that my connection has been selected, I also have to go ahead and select a sample. So in other words, with our branded connectors, they want to know what type of action you want to execute against that product or platform. We can expose a list of those actions by heading over to Options, Choose Sample. That's going to generate an entire list of these actions. Sometimes there's hundreds, sometimes there's thousands, in some cases tens of thousands. And really what we're looking to do here within the scope of this is search for technically upsert account. We can go ahead and click on upsert account, and that's going to populate the request payload with a sample of what the data needs to look like, and of course prime the rest of the node for the action of actually creating that account. Then we can make sure that the quick map result is aware of what that request needs to look like, and from there we can begin to actually map that data from point to point. We can do so by simply dragging across the fields that make sense. So we've got two types. We have fields at a structural level. So for instance, a row should be an account, and the name could, for argument's sake, go into name. And that's going to then give you a preview of what the data looks like on the other side. Now, on top of your ability to actually go and map the data structurally, you are able to supplement, enrich, and validate the data through functions that you can apply onto these expression blocks here. Now, as I click, you can actually see a list of all these functions. You're welcome to go ahead and take a look at these at our help center. Ultimately, it is a list of functions that will allow you to run things like sum, count, lookup, if statements, string and math operations, a whole bunch of things that will allow you to get that data to a next step. So let's go ahead and look at what a more complete mapping might look like. I've simply skipped ahead to the point where I've mapped all the relevant fields, and you can see a more filled preview on the other side, and I've used a couple of functions in the filter expression blocks as well. A few examples of those would be combining first name and last name through a string manipulation over here. We have the ability to do lookups, so we actually have a tertiary payload which has a value which results in the return of either a direct customer or prospect as a type based off of a value that came through the source, which would be a 0 or 1. And then we, of course, did some stuff to, for instance, trim the billing street and check that the length of the postal code was not more than 5. We do also have some tools that can allow you to make your mapping a little bit easier. So if you take a look at this toolbar over here, you have Mirror Map and Smart Map. Mirror Map is effectively going to try and find the fields at the same container level with the same name and then map them. And Smart Map uses a little bit of intelligence to determine if those fields are relevant and whether they should be mapped. Let's go ahead and blank out the mapping just to give you an idea of how Smart Map works. Here we have completely fresh mapping. So let's go ahead and engage Smart Map and see what happens. Here you can see how Smart Map has now actually mapped some of the basic fields for us. It hasn't, of course, performed some of the functions that I previously showed you, but a lot of the basic fields have been included, including some of the ones at the bottom here, such as cell phone number and description. Going back to the completed mapping, we can now go ahead and close this by clicking on the confirm button. And the last step of this test would be to hook up all of our execution flows from point to point, at which point we could then run this integration as we had previously shown you. Now let's go ahead and swap over to the more complete one so we can talk to some of the features that were present in the initial workflow we showed you guys. Taking a look at the more production-ready workflow, we'll notice some of the very common elements, of course, that we had just looked at was the flat file, our quick map, and then our Salesforce node, but we have a number of other nodes in between that will add to the logic within this particular integration. So first of all, as I said previously, we get this data by monitoring a particular folder within a machine, or on my machine rather, and we use File Watcher to do that. That node will then return the actual path of the file that was added to the folder, which we can then extract through our file node. Then, business as usual, we interpret that via the flat file, which we can then of course send to Quick Map for mapping. And then on top of that, we have something called a reduce, whose responsibility it is to actually determine if there's any deltas in the data since the last time it saw it, and only return that which has changed. That contributes to what I showed you previously, whereby you can manipulate a certain record and then only those are sent through. This is a two-stage reduce commit, meaning we have to first check what the response of Salesforce was if those rows were successful, before we can commit it to say, next time you see it, if it hasn't changed, leave it. And we do so through a couple of tools. One is to merge the response from Salesforce with our original payload. And then finally to use Quick Map once again to single out those which have failed by only returning those with a success rate of true. This whole particular setup means that you can execute this as many times as you want. So long as the data has changed in that file, it will then only pass it along to the next step. That's about that for the demonstration of this particular use case. I hope what I've been able to show you today is how you can work with some of the basic tools that would constitute an integration, so mainly your extract, transform, and load components, as well as giving you a bit of context around some of the supporting tools that allow you to turn something from a simple integration into something that is production ready and robust. At the end of the day, whatever your vision of a production ready workflow is, or however you would like it to perform, we will make sure that we have the tooling available for you to plug onto the canvas and configure that integration or automation to whatever level of complexity you or your business use case requires. If you're interested in exploring some of the concepts and features that I've just shown you in more depth, you're welcome to head over to help.flowgear.net, where you'll find a list of comprehensive articles giving you more detail on some of the things that I've shown you today. On top of that, you're welcome to sign up for a free trial and explore Flowgear at your own pace. We do have a certification course available that'll take you through some of the foundational elements of Flowgear. And then finally, if you'd like, you're welcome to reach out to our team and inquire about a complimentary proof of concept where we can go ahead and show you some of what you're looking to achieve as part of the POC process.